Good morning. Good morning, friends. It is so wonderful to have each one of you here with us this morning for this Powering Inclusion Summit. We could not be happier to host you, happier to welcome you, and happier, more than that, to partner with you all, arm in arm, to move our region forward. This morning, I want to say a few things to you about where we've been since we were together just about a year ago, kicking off the public launch of the Center for Economic Inclusion. If you can remember when you first recognized that systems of oppression, systems of inequity, systems of division were not broken, but were actually working just the way that they were created to work. If you can remember how old you were when you recognized that, where you were when you recognized that, how you felt when you recognized that, then you'll be in a position for the work that we have to do, not only today together, but for many, many years to come together. Because it is true, in fact, and we've heard it from both of our mayors, who I thank for being here already this morning, the systems that we're fighting to dismantle, the systems that we're working to change, have to be changed not just because they're not working, not just because they were broken, but because they were created to exclude some and benefit others. And in order for us to achieve this economy that works for everyone, that allows people of color to not just be a part of our communities, not only be welcome into our organizations, but actually be positioned to thrive at the same pace, at the same rate as others, it requires the same level of intentional effort to include. To overcome that intentional exclusion, it requires policies and procedures that begin to change a culture, a fabric of our community, a fabric of our economy, such that it can include the assets of people of color. It can include the talent of people of color, the brilliance of people of color. And to do so, yes, because our morals convict us to believe that something different is required. Yes, because our community inspires us to believe that it's not okay for children to know so early in their lives that systems were created to exclude them, but also because our entire economy depends on it. We shared that data with you a year ago, and it wasn't necessarily new data, but what I hear over and over again is you are helping us at the Center for Economic Inclusion think differently about that data, not get lost in looking down because we have the disparities, not get confused about needing to fix disparities because we're struggling to compete with another region, but aspiring to be the community, the region, the state that we can be, working to be the region, the cities, the counties, the state that we can be, that we aspire to be, placing an intentional focus on goals. And that is why the Center for Economic Inclusion was created, because we looked around as partners, not just me, but many partners, many of whom I'm grateful are still in this room, and said, we're doing a lot of things right. We're doing great workforce development programs. We have really strong business development and investment programs. We have great streams of funding flowing in many directions. We have intentional effort happening to increase the housing affordability in our market. A lot of great things right, and yet some things wrong. Working in silos, not being able to think about the role that the market plays in the work to build an economy that works for everyone, and struggling to keep everyone at the table all the time, not just for a year, not just for 3 years when a national funder incentivizes us to come together, but for the decades that it will take to dismantle policies and systems that have been put in place that continue to harm each and every member of our entire region and state yet today. You said yes. You said, yes, I'll sign up for that region, and I want to say thank you. Thank you to you as partners. A huge debt of thanks to our investors who have invested in this early organization. We are a startup like the startup businesses that we partner with, and it takes a lot for a funder, whether it's a local funder or a national, to say we're going to invest in a new idea that's taking on a decades-old problem in a quite different way. So a big thank you to our investors and partners. A huge thank you to our board of directors who work alongside our leadership team, arm in arm, to create a governance structure and shift it so that it can support this work. And more than anyone today, I have to say a huge debt of thanks to the mightiest, most committed, most talented and creative team in the Twin Cities region. My center team is some in the room and some outside of the room. We are smaller than you would believe for the work that we pull off. But we've got a group of people who believe that it is not only worth it, but that it is possible to create an economy that works for everyone. And these folks get up every day, go arm in arm together, and pull off the amazing. And indeed, in launching this summit, you would not believe the number of short months since it's been that we really decided we're gonna make this happen on April 30th. This team has done the unbelievable, and I am truly grateful. And for that, I'm gonna ask you to join me in thanking them, even though they are not all in the room. As we think about the work of the center, I want to just refresh for just a moment so that you can think about us as your partner. As you go through today, you'll experience the talent and the brilliance and the hard work of many, many, many people, not only throughout our region, but also from across the country, who are here not only to inspire you with great ideas, because you could get that at just about any conference that says the words diversity, inclusion, or equity. But this summit is about equipping you with tools, resources, knowledge, and networks. So tap into the talent and know that these folks have been brought together because of this mission that you see before you. The work to not only think about each of the individual silos of work that we take on, economic development, human capital and workforce development, transportation and housing, and impact and investment for businesses, but to think about how we pull all of those pieces together, begin to work at the intersections of economic inclusion through a lens of race, place, and income, meaning that we assess our challenges to understand when is race the driver, when is a location, the neighborhood that a community is coming from, a family is coming from, when is that the challenge, and when might income be the challenge, and when do we have systems that are so broken and challenged that all three are at play, and then designing solutions that can work at those intersections as well. You're about to hear from my wonderful colleague at Brookings about the indicators for an inclusive regional economy. We promised you that we'd come forward with this when we launched the center a year ago, and you asked us for a couple of things. One was to be sure that we had relevant data that was disaggregated and intersectional. Our region is not short on reports, we're not short on research, we're not short on facts about disparities, but you wanted data that would help you understand what was happening and why it was happening, that was intersectional and helped us move to do the work that is intersectional. You also ask us to start drawing connections between what's local and what's regional. How do we act locally and think regionally? How do we act at the regional scale and think about its impact on local communities? You ask us to do the connections between personal action to organizational impact, acknowledging the role of personal agency. While there are systems at play, each one of us belong to, if not many, at least one. And to think about the role that each one of us could take day to day to start to move the needle, and then the role that organizational action, whether in the nonprofit sector, the private sector, government, or civics, play in creating an economy that truly does work and driving results that prove it. And you ask us to be a partner to help you come out after you receive these indicators and start to drive internal accountability and results, to take your own data systems and think about how they align to a broader set of regional metrics. And we're here to deliver. Over the last year, since the launch, we've had many partners who have sat around conference rooms and tables and kitchens and libraries and helped to bring this work forth. We have studied the best of the indicators across the country that have been developed to address economic inclusion, and then we've come right back home to say, but what matters here? Because ultimately, I'm not in this work so that we can beat Mississippi. I was in Memphis last week as their community discussed shared prosperity and what it would take to move their community forward. And I was grateful to hear a very transparent and blunt and hard set of conversations from leaders across sectors. But I was inspired to come back here, not to set a goal that is to beat Memphis or the next city that we're struggling with, competing with on being the worst of the worst or the best of the worst, but to say, what is it that we can do in the Minneapolis-Saint Paul region to be the best that we can be, to take the talent that we have and fully maximize it in our economy. And these folks have helped us do that. Greater MSP partnered with us and our data team last year to be able to further incorporate economic inclusion into the regional dashboard. Mary Kay Bailey and John Misavage, where are you? Where are they hiding? Please stand. They're hiding from me somewhere. Thank you so much. They're not going to stand because they're shy. But these two people have worked a mighty work over the last year, leading our data team, working with all of our partners that you see listed here and in the handout, and have made sure that this data is not just data that has integrity, but data that has meaning. The Brookings Institution leveraged their knowledge and their expertise to help us refine the indicators, and Prime Digital Academy, a local asset that we could invest in, created an online platform that you'll get to experience later. Now, it's up to each one of us to do the hard work of taking in the results, again, not to become depressed by disparities. This is not a summit about disparities. But to think about the possibilities that exist in an economy where everyone is not just appreciated, not just welcomed, but where there's a true seat at the table, where there's true power shifting, where there's true economic participation, and where the assets of everyone in our entire region are fully leveraged to grow our entire economy. And that's the work that we're thankful that you're here to do alongside us. At this time, I am thrilled to be able to hand it to Robin for our next speaker.
For a more in-depth look at the indicators of an inclusive regional economy, I'd like to introduce Alan Berube. Alan is Senior Fellow and Deputy Director at the Brookings Institution Metropolitan Policy Program, where he coordinates and amplifies research on how to strengthen economic opportunity in regions, cities, and in communities. He's the author of several publications on economic and demographic trends in the metropolitan areas, social policies affecting families and communities, and the role of cities in a globalizing economy. Please welcome Alan Berube.
Good morning. Pro tip, don't follow Tawanna on the podium. It's a bad idea. Seriously, thank you so much to the center and Tawanna and her team for just being great partners and examples, I think, of the kind of organizations and commitment that every metropolitan region that's struggling to combine growth and opportunity, I think, really needs. Thanks as well to our supporters at the McKnight Foundation, who have really been our anchors and supporters for work that my team at Brookings has done in Minneapolis-Saint Paul, going back almost through our whole existence, 22 years, really, and I think really kicked off back in 2005 with partners at the Itasca Project on a report called Mind the Gap, which some of you might recall, which I think in a way began to open up a conversation about racial and economic disparities in this region. But now I'm so grateful to see that we're getting not just to chronicling the disparities, but driving forward solutions. And that's really the work that we're here to discuss today. I'm going to talk about a couple things, both about what our latest research at the Brookings Institution reveals about the state of inclusion in Greater Minneapolis-Saint Paul, as well as introduce the center's new Inclusion Indicators project. The project, of course, as Tawanna just said, is not Brookings, but we are so grateful to have been advisors on that project, and I really think the credit goes to the center staff and to Mary Kay Bailey and John Misavage and the group of advisors they had here in Minneapolis-Saint Paul to bring that to life. So my presentation has three parts. First, I'll talk about why inclusion is important and why metropolitan areas like Minneapolis-Saint Paul are an important scale for pursuing economic inclusion. Second, I'll take a look at how Greater MSP is doing on the inclusion front based on data from Brookings Metro Monitor. And then thirdly and finally, I'll introduce the center's indicators of an inclusive regional economy and what they reveal about the deeper strengths and challenges about and around delivering inclusion locally. And I'll try to do this as quickly as possible so that we save sufficient time for a panel discussion. So let me just start a little bit by saying about why we think cities and regions are critical channels for economic growth and opportunity, which is sort of an article of faith And where I work at Brookings, it's called the Metropolitan Policy Program, so of course you believe in the power of metropolitan areas. This is not an article of faith everywhere. When our program was founded at the Brookings Institution, my colleagues were in a room of economists who asked us, what is this thing about cities and why do you want to study that? So from time to time we have to sort of defend our existence, so I'll do that quite briefly. So city regions like Minneapolis-Saint Paul are in fact the workhorses of advanced economies like the United States. If you just take the 100 largest metropolitan economies in our country, they occupy about 12% of our land mass, but together they generate more than 3/4 of our gross domestic product. This region alone is a $260 billion economy. It's equivalent in size to that country on the right. Anybody want to name that country? Finland, of course, is a Scandinavian country I'm going to compare you to here in Minnesota. Yes, indeed, that is the country that has the most similar GDP to the Minneapolis-Saint Paul region. So size matters, yes, but it's actually what makes metropolitan economies powerful that makes them critical vehicles for inclusion, because they're where the assets of the modern economy aggregate and combine to create growth and opportunity. Through innovative companies, talented workers, infrastructure that connects people to jobs and products to markets, and then institutions, government, civic, philanthropic, that set the platforms and conditions for businesses and families to thrive. So the region's performance and leveraging these assets for growth and inclusion forms the basis of Greater MSP's Regional Indicators Dashboard and the Center's Inclusive Indicators Project, as I'll talk about in a few minutes. So this is probably self-evident to a lot of people in the room today. I also want to talk just a little bit about our philosophy about why inclusion is a central feature of modern economic development. And a lot of places where we work, we end up either talking to advocates for growth or advocates for inclusion, and they don't really talk to one another, and if they do, they don't share the same language, right? But economic growth and economic inclusion are goals that have to be pursued together, or else we're not going to succeed in achieving either of them. So to that end, our annual Metro Monitor publication benchmarks the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States on how well they achieve three things: growth that expands capital, jobs, and entrepreneurship; prosperity that delivers higher quality jobs that in turn improve overall standards of living; and then inclusion that ensures that all people and communities benefit, especially across race and income groups. These concepts are fundamentally connected. Cities and metropolitan areas that offer greater opportunity to all of their residents over time experience faster overall growth, and that's what you see here in this chart. Metropolitan areas in which low-income children experience greater upward mobility, as you move from left to right across the bottom of the chart, over time experience faster per capita income growth. And they prosper in this way because they access higher quality workforce skills, they gain more from their entrepreneurs, and fundamentally they find more of what might otherwise be hidden innovative talent. And more than just top-line economic inclusion, we see the inclusion by race and ethnicity is increasingly critical to growth and opportunity for what economists might call both cyclical reasons and structural reasons. So cyclically, as depicted in the chart on the left-hand side, we're getting to what you might call the top of the business cycle. There's not a whole lot more economic ground to be gained for white adults on outcomes like employment, but there are still significant gaps for people of color, such that their progress in those regards will really determine whether we'll make additional gains overall as an economy and society. And then structurally, as depicted by the chart on the right, demographic shifts in our society mean that more and more of our workforce growth is coming from people of color. And even in historically and predominantly white metropolitan areas like this region, people of color account for the majority of recent population growth. And as we saw in the video earlier, that statistic, about 58% of babies being born here in Minneapolis to women of color as well. So given the importance of metropolitan areas, inclusion and racial inclusion, in particular to economic success, how is this region doing? So our latest Metro Monitor offers some preliminary answers, and I'm going to look at this based on Minneapolis-St. Paul's performance relative to a set of 11 other peer metropolitan areas against which it's benchmarked in Greater MSP's Regional Indicators Project. What I'll show here is much more top-line data than you'll see in that dashboard, but I think it's enough to suggest that there's a lot of room for progress in this region. So first, growth. As I said earlier, it measures outcomes on GDP, on jobs, and entrepreneurship. And in these, Minneapolis-St. Paul performed better than the average metropolitan area in the United States, and that's denoted by it being sort of above that invisible line across the x-axis there, but only 8th out of 11 peer metropolitan areas ranked on these factors. Prosperity measures outcomes on productivity, average wages, and overall standards of living. And here, Minneapolis-St. Paul's ranking is not much different. It's 8th out of 12 metropolitan areas, behind not only big tech hubs like San Francisco and Seattle, but also similar diversified metropolitan economies like Portland, Boston, and Denver. And then thirdly, inclusion measures outcomes on employment opportunity, household earnings, and poverty. And I think most worrisome of these three dimensions, we're seeing MSP's performance slipping even a little further behind its peers to 10th among 12 metropolitan areas, pulled down by the falling median earnings that we've seen in this region over a 10-year period. So these are 10-year trends. It's important as well, I think, to look at short-term outcomes to see if things are headed in the right direction. And here, actually, our most recent report indicated even more troubling signs, particularly with respect to racial inclusion. In 2017, people of color in Minneapolis-St. Paul actually fell farther behind their white counterparts on outcomes like earnings, outcomes like poverty, and overall, the region ranked among the bottom 10 metropolitan areas nationally on racial inclusion change in 2017, which I think in turn explains its subpar performance on overall inclusion because, as indicated earlier, the outcomes for overall inclusion are increasingly driven by outcomes specifically for communities of color. So that's why the work that the center is publishing today is so timely and important. You'll see it here in this handout where Tawanna is not cut off. Her picture's not cut off as she is on the slide. Sorry about that, Tawanna. My cropping skills leave something to be desired. So please check out this publication. I'm just going to go through a few of the key statistics from that publication. There's so much more to be revealed in the handout itself as well as online. I'll talk a little bit about that. But as Tawanna described, this is a companion publication to Greater MSP's Regional Indicators Dashboard, and it's specifically designed to dig deeper on the roots of the persistent inclusion challenges in this metropolitan area, particularly those affecting communities of color. So to that end, it examines not only overall indicators of inclusive growth, but it also reveals trends in the underlying drivers of growth across three additional dimensions: economic development, human capital, and transportation and access, which actually closely mirror the assets of regional economies I mentioned towards the beginning of my talk, and they also reflect the core areas of focus for the work of the center. So in each category, the indicators disaggregate key measures by income, by race, and by place. Here you can see the basic demographic makeup of the Minneapolis-St. Paul region in 2017, which was about 3/4 non-Hispanic white, with nearly 900,000 residents, people of color, comprising the rest of the population. There are 14 indicators overall. These are shown and described, of course, in the handout. And again, I'm just going to highlight a couple in each category that I think allude to the overall storyline for the region. And I hope in the panel discussion and the day to follow, we can get deeper into some of the other indicators as well. So first, on measures of overall inclusive growth, which are actually derived directly from the Greater MSP dashboard, we see high employment rates for Hispanic residents and increasing employment for Black residents in recent years. We also see increasing wages across the board for all races and ethnicities. This is good news. But significant gaps, of course, remain. And as our Metro Monitor revealed, they actually widened somewhat in 2017 across race groups. So the result, which is reflected in your handout, is that there are too many workers of color in this region who are still earning wages that don't really lift them and their families above the poverty line. On economic development, of course, multiple factors contribute to where businesses locate, which businesses successfully get bank loans and where commercial, industrial, and residential development occurs within the region. The indicators show continued underrepresentation of people of color among the ranks of entrepreneurs. So in the chart on the left, you can see that blacks in this region make up only 1.7% of business owners versus nearly 9% of the overall population. And other indicators suggest continued undersupply of small business capital to low income and majority non-white neighborhoods in the region. More positively, in the chart on the right, we see higher poverty neighborhoods in the region experiencing similar growth in commercial, industrial, and public building investment over the past several years. On human capital, Minnesota's workforce development system, as indicated by the chart on the left, actually does appear to be doing a good job in delivering income gains to people of color, particularly for those people who are moving from some employment through those services into better employment. At the same time, however, the region's four-year colleges and universities aren't really succeeding in graduating people of color. Fewer than half of Black and American Indian students in this region earn a degree within 6 years, and we've actually seen those shares falling in the last few years. On access to home ownership, over the past 5 years, home ownership among the region's middle-income white households was actually around 20 to 30 percentage points higher than middle-income households of color. And this relates in turn to what you see in the chart on the right, to much higher mortgage loan denial rates that middle-income people of color experience compared to their white counterparts, a gap that's closed only marginally in the past couple of years. And then finally, on renting costs and job access, we see that the majority of low-income renters in this region are cost-burdened regardless of their race. And on this count, I'd really recommend the Minnesota Housing Partnership's new State of the State's Housing Report, which looks much more deeply at this and many other housing issues. Another cost reflected in the chart on the right, many residents of the region's low-income neighborhoods face limited access to jobs if they don't have cars. High-poverty neighborhoods near downtowns and along the light rail do enjoy good access to jobs, but those high-poverty neighborhoods to the north and west of downtown Minneapolis and those encircling downtown St. Paul have many fewer transit-accessible jobs. So overall, these indicators, I think, portray a region with much work to do, particularly on behalf of its residents of color. The result, as Mayor Carter was reflecting, of years, decades, and generations of policies that have systematically and systemically disinvested in these communities. So I think that's the work that remains to be done, is the work that we're here to talk about today. These indicators, I think, are really just a first step at getting a deeper picture of economic inclusion in the region. I want to say this is first of its kind work. There was no template for the center and Mary Kay and John to follow, but I know that the center invites the partners that are here today to share their ideas and their strategies for building on the important foundation that these indicators establish. I've shown you only the really top-line charts for the region. The online tool will allow you to probe much more deeply with interactive charts, further disaggregation by race, place, and income. The mapping tools in particular enable users to examine several indicators at the neighborhood level by year and to zero in on the experience of low-income communities and those that are majority people of color. As much as the indicators and the mapping tools are great, though, I think what makes the center's project unique is how it connects to action. And in each of the three key domains, the online indicators and the online tool include examples of strategies to increase economic inclusion that merit community engagement, merit community support. You'll see snapshots of videos here about MEDA's mini MBA program for entrepreneurs of color, Connect's MSP's hiring and social network platform for graduates of diverse partner programs, and the University of Minnesota's work to document the extent of transportation mismatch for the region's low-income job seekers. I think overall, these illustrate that inclusion challenges that are facing this region and others are not intractable. Smart ideas and efforts are out there. They just need collective will, sustained focus, and intentionality in order to drive results. Which leads me to my final slide, to paraphrase Arnold Schwarzenegger in Kindergarten Cop, economic inclusion is not a program. I've always wanted to do that. That was my first try. See, I got some work to do on it. more seriously, economic inclusion is a shared philosophy, right? It's not a program. It's a value that has to run throughout all efforts in a region to improve economic growth and opportunity. So for my part, I just want to say we at Brookings are really excited to see this region once again leading the way nationally and embracing that value to ensure that all of its residents can enjoy great opportunities that this region has to offer. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much to Alan and the entire Brookings team for the partnership and again, going deeper into these indicators and equipping our region with the tools and information that we need to be able to truly make a change for our economy. I want to share just a little bit with you about what happens next. You're going to spend some time today hearing more and more about these indicators and hearing about the work of the region, but I want to start the morning being sure that you know, what does this center do with you? To be able to make sure that in 5 years, in 10 years, we're not only coming together and looking at the data, and unfortunately, as we've been in the last several years, seeing that data not move, but that we actually are seeing progress because of the action that you're doing. Our organization is your partner. We exist to be able to support employers in every single sector in making change. And we believe that that change starts by raising our awareness. This data is designed to be able to help make sure that each one of us understand exactly what's happening in our economy, who is benefiting from the work that we're doing, who is not, and how we can pull multiple levers to experience change. Our work then is about equipping individuals, equipping organizations, and ultimately supporting those organizations who will make the changes that we need in our region. And we are your partners. Our organization has established and refined ourselves to be able to support your work, whether that's directly through strategic partnerships that we may have today or may launch as a result of our relationships today, through consulting services that we can provide your business to gain more inclusivity within your workplace, to address your supply chain opportunities, to help you as an individual make more equitable investments as you invest your dollars, and ultimately to help all of us have more results-driven shared accountability. We're getting results today, but we're capable of much more, and we look forward to being able to partner with you to do just that. And now, I'll turn it back to Robin to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Tawanna. Our panelists include Peter Frosch, CEO of Greater MSP, Priya Morioka, who is the founder and COO of Global Language Connections, David Mortensen, who is chairman of Mortensen, and Alan Berube and Tawanna Black. Please give a round of applause to our panelists. So I'm just going to kick it off and just start with a simple question. If I'm sitting out here in the audience and I heard what you just said, and I said to myself, well, I've increased diverse hiring at my job. You hear statistics that this is a great place for people to work. Why do I, as a tool like indicators for an inclusive economy, important for a region like MSP then?
I'll go.
Thank you.
I mean, it's important because effective strategies are informed by good data. And one of the reasons why I'm so excited about these indicators, they represent, I think, a milestone, a major step for this region in following the data to an effective strategy, which in the big picture is an inclusive strategy. And the way that these are broken out, I mean, I'm just kind of sitting there at the table starting to jot down, well, so let's talk about what we need to do in each of these specific indicators to turn those dials. And by bringing it down to this level, it brings us closer to the ability to take effective action and to align our resources and to be able to push together.
I'm sorry, any question? You had an answer as well?
Well, I think I'd say two things. One is I appreciate the fact that Mayor Carter and Mayor Fry talked about the systematic issues in our policy and in our regulatory environment, but those same systematic issues and those biases live in our businesses every day. And I think the data is really an important piece, but data doesn't necessarily lead to action. And we need to combine the data with stories. And if I can tell just a quick story, is a leader in this business community and she wrote an op-ed piece in 2016 about her daughter, Celestina, who graduated in the top third of her Big Ten school in a STEM, and I'm an engineer, and we hire engineers, and only 19% of graduating engineers are women, less than 10% are people of color. So this woman graduating with a STEM degree out of a Big Ten school sends out her resume to 100 companies in the Twin Cities, and she doesn't get a single call back. And her mother and father say, well, let's do a little social. This is in 2016. This is today, ladies and gentlemen. She says, let's do a social experiment, and they change the name on the resume to Kristen. Within 72 hours, she has 3 phone calls and 3 interviews set up. And so I went back to our HR team and I said, hey, what's the chance that Celestina submitted her resume to our company? And can you guarantee me that we didn't reject her based on unconscious bias that live within our system? Lots of mad scrambling ensued. And we recognized and we started to ask ourselves the questions: what biases exists within our organization, and how are we going to break down those barriers to change? It was that story that changed what we did as an organization, but it's just one simple step, and we need to combine both of those 2 things in order to get all of our organizations and to root out those systematic biases that are pervasive.
So it's a social experiment in one family. It's going back and looking at a real life situation in another. How do you get past the data? How do you take the data and you work with the data, but how do you get the employees, how do you get the people within the structure to stop seeing numbers and start seeing people?
I think it's a huge question, because I find this, and a colleague said this last night, and I think I've said it several times, that you do what you know. And when you know better, you do better. At the same time, when we see the data, it feels like a shock to the system. Wait a minute, I'm sure when people got that question about, wait a minute, have we in this office, where we all believe we have the right ideals, where we have the right morals, have we possibly now done something that when we read it in the paper feels shocking and appalling and could not happen in our place, right? Couldn't happen in Minnesota, couldn't happen in our space. And so getting past the data requires believing that it's possible to get past the data. And right now, I think too often the weight of disparities, the weight of inequities, workforce inequities, business development, investment, housing, everything we just put up on the stage and more feels so heavy, we tire out before we actually move the needle on them. We move the needle incrementally, and then we say, you know what, it's time now to go fund education. We move the needle a little bit there, and then we say, okay, we didn't make far enough progress, it's time maybe to go switch to housing. Instead of thinking about, okay, wait a minute, we have to believe that it's possible and know it's not going to happen in 3 to 5 years.
So
that as well is in part the difference between viewing these efforts as so separate and on the side, like we'll work on this aspect of inclusion for a few years, and then we'll work on that aspect of inclusion for a few years, as opposed to taking our mainstream programs, the many millions of dollars that we spend in each of these areas of economic policy and social policy, and putting racial inclusion much more at the center of just how we do those quote unquote mainstream things. Because if we're not willing to mainstream that as an issue in the way that we conduct public policy and private enterprise, we're not going to get there through the marginal stuff.
I guess I also, the more that we see the opportunity in this moment, I mean, for each of us as decision makers and as organizations, the faster this can go. To your example, David, whatever company was ready and looking for the opportunity would have had a great engineer.
Exactly.
Right, at a time when the workforce is really tight. I had breakfast with President Privino at Augsburg this week, and the story that he told was really compelling. Higher ed is an industry, right, as a sector that is going through disruption, and there are challenges with enrollment. But that's not what Augsburg is finding. right? That he told a story about starting in 2006 at roughly 12% students of color, and year on year, there was no one big thing, but they went in pursuit of becoming and being, a truly open and inclusive campus. And last year, 62% students of color, and growing now every single year. And their experience and data shows that they've become kind of a destination of choice for students of color, which are most students, right? So it's a business model that is a huge opportunity for Augsburg, and there's a big kind of first mover advantage in an economic sense to figure this out.
I think in our business we really find that a lot, as well as changing the narrative to the opportunity. A lot of the companies that we talk to about the increase in immigrants and their diversity and the different opportunities and challenges that they might face, we're met with, a lot of head nodding and okay, that's great, but there's not this sense of action to how can we change it. And so I think positioning it as this is an opportunity for the first mover, much like the colleges have, you will then become known as a brand for creating the opportunities, meeting people where they're at, and actually bringing out the best in people because they're bringing their full selves to work. And then you will be an attraction for the rest of their community to come there versus when a lot of times we find that people just kind of, again, head nod and say, okay, well, we'll just, try to look at things and not really have an actionable plan.
I really like the framework that you talked about it in, because it's really a business imperative for two reasons. One is partly access to the best talent. You need to open your aperture to the entire talent pool. But secondly, you need to create an environment, an inclusive environment that is what Google's study of high-performing teams, I think they called it Project Aristotle, found. If you're going to be a high-performing team and innovate and have that entrepreneurial spirit, you have to have an inclusive environment that's based on trust and psychological safety, where people can bring their whole true selves. That's the sauce of high-performing teams and innovation. And so it's talent and innovation that are business imperatives in the 21st century. We have to fix and change our organizational structures so we've got that inclusive and diverse foundation.
So here's my question. How do you do that? So you don't take this data and you feel like you're spinning plates. You've got one thing solved here, now I'm going to the next thing. Now I got to come back because this plate is still not taken care of. How do you do that from the start with a comprehensive business plan based on data like this that you're seeing here today?
I hate to
That's what you're
reemphasize.
doing, right? You're doing that?
Well, yeah, we are. And at the same time, I think some of what you said is true too, that it can't be a business plan that's on the side. I love that you asked the question with comprehensive business plan, because it challenges each one of us to think about our organizations, to think about not only the strategic plan that you may have that's 3 or 5 years, but to think about what's the work plan for the next 3 quarters. What am I going to do when I leave here today to incorporate these principles into the next 3 quarters? When we make it so big and aspirational, and when the challenge is so significant, and it is, I don't minimize the challenge, it feels too far out of reach to start taking action. And so we put off action and we put off action, or we think somebody else is doing it, or going to meetings feels like the action. And we have a lot of those, and they're important. But they're not the actions inside our organizations that, to David's point, are going to start to change that culture, or going to help us uncover the unconscious bias that is at play, uncover the policies that are holding us back, the procedures that are holding us back, and then start to rewrite those. But it has to be deeply ingrained into the strategy that's driving the business, that's driving the nonprofit, that's driving the foundation, that's driving that city department. It has to be fully woven in, or it'll get done for a while and we'll cut resources when we need to pull back.
I do think there's, as I think you and I were talking about last night, there's a sweet spot between right now, at least the long-term focus and the long-term commitment that's necessary to really close the gaps, and short-term urgency born of where we are in the business cycle too, right? I think that the talent imperatives, the access to the full talent pool, the full suite of innovative individuals, ideas, and entrepreneurs is cresting right now because of the tight labor market, because people are looking for investable opportunities. So if we're not willing to take a quarter by quarter approach to making progress on these things, it will be a real missed opportunity, a lost opportunity for regions like this too.
I think about the data that you were showing, Al, in the beginning, and it's to look at that and say, inclusion is the bet, right, that we have to place. And I think about, some people talk about the kind of belief that underlines the behavior, right? Until your beliefs change, your behavior is not fundamentally going to change. And one of the kind of core issues that I've seen in this work is that not enough of us yet believe that the way that we are going to get growth is through inclusion. And I hear it stated, it comes out in a lot of different conversations, and it's not always explicit, but I can tell the framing is a trade-off.
Yes, right. It's not only that.
I know this is important. That's important, but at the same time, we have to drive growth. And in part, I think that's why the data is important, and that's why we need to use the data to make this case week on week, because it's the opposite of the reality. The reality is in this region and in every region in the U.S. that until we become more inclusive, or as we become more inclusive, we will become more competitive. We will see more growth. And I think that we need to look for that underlying belief and address it and then connect it to behaviors.
Okay, so we're working very hard. You see everybody that's trying to really commit. They see this data. So why in 10 years we have not moved past 1% in closing that gap? What truly is it? Is it beyond just our own inherent biases, or is there a parallelization that happens when people see data like this and they look at their own companies and they don't know where to start first, or they think that they have done enough but really haven't and don't know how to proceed further? What needs to be done?
Well, one of the things that I appreciate a lot about what the center is doing is it's not just connecting and preparing and developing the talent with the skills and tools to be successful. It's helping the businesses fundamentally recognize their underlying culture and change their culture. And culture change is like growing trees. It's only going to happen over time, and I appreciate you have to get belief that it is your business imperative to change, and that takes persistence and consistency. And I watch in this market today more businesses and more leaders personally learn on their own D&I learning journey, but leaning in really to the challenges of their businesses. And I fundamentally I feel like we're on that curve in the up ramp, and that in the next 3 to 5 years, if we continue our focus, we're going to see real acceleration.
I agree with David. I think, I grew up here. I grew up in Northeast Minneapolis, and I think what I really liked about the center and the data that they brought forward is it's creating more awareness, action. There's these measurable indicators that they've come up with, and the further disaggregation to break down the various differences between the communities of color really helped to uncover the story. I think having a team that's passionate about it, putting it at the forefront consistently, has kind of shaken up our Minnesota nice a little bit, and really gotten people to say, okay, there is something here. This is deeper than we thought, that now there's actually items that we can action against, which I think really works for a lot of people, especially in the private sector. And then, continuing to bring forward events like this. I remember going to the first smaller roundtable, and then I think it was at the chamber breakfast, the indicators. And I'm not gonna lie, 3/4 of the people left the room. And today I was so excited and honored to participate in this when it was like sold out, So I just think that it's woken up the conversation. And as you mentioned, David, I know even for myself, I'm learning about things they don't teach in the school room and pass it on to my children. Things like the fair housing and the implications that's had for generations on African Americans and being able to create generational wealth for their families. So when people say, oh, well, everybody just pull up your bootstraps, we all kind of like, let's just get started and work hard. Some communities that's not possible for and hasn't been. They haven't been provided the same opportunities. And if we're not learning that and acknowledging that now, there are future communities coming up in the immigrant population that are going to face those same things. And so I'm super excited for the center to be able to bring forward that data.
Well, let me follow up with you and ask you then, so what programs, what policies that the center has do you see that can best equip regional and local businesses?
I think bringing the cross-sector collaboration together around the issues is really important. I think they've done a great job in the last year bringing the word accountability into some of the other sectors where funding does happen. So it's not just, okay, great, we have these programs, they're there, but it's like, are we moving the needle? What's accountable? Is investment being made into communities of color, businesses of color?
Mm-hmm.
We're working on a very specific example right now around workforce development together. And to bring out that comment that was made in the setup about system change and how important that is. You know, we've been doing the regional indicator dashboard since 2015, and one of the reasons this is so exciting is this is a direct outcome of the region seeing the data on all. We're good at many things in this region, right? But racial inclusion is not one of them. Right, and we saw year on year in poverty and labor force participation, educational outcomes. There's something systematic, and something that I've learned from that project around indicators is that when you're 1 and 2 in a tough peer set, it's culture and it's a system, and when you're 10, 11, 12, it's culture and it's a system, and that is tough. It's tough to see that and know that and recognize it. But now that we're kind of moving into the disaggregation, we can really attack it. And we have to. I mean, none of us are old enough, despite however we answered those questions earlier, to have set up the systems we have. None of us created these systems. But we all have to make some conscious choices about, are we going to perpetuate all these systems, right? What do we really owe the systems that we have? And it is up to us, and we have agency to start bending those systems. They do not change easily, right? We are seeing that, in the workforce development space. We've got people of goodwill working together to try to do something different at scale, and it's really hard. But the value at stake is huge. If we can take that system, which matters so much to both job seekers and employers, and make it truly inclusive, which it's not today, but we're working on it, and we're going to stay working on it. And the center is a major new asset on a team at a regional scale that's going to get to that conclusion.
I want to ask everybody that's here, and I think David kind of started with this, what areas have you seen the most success in trying to really build an inclusive economy in your workforce? What are some of the successes and what are some of the failures? What are some of the things you have to work on?
Well, I think the biggest successes we've had actually have been in the field with men and women craft workers. And, frankly, it started by government changing a policy and setting bars in terms of participation and hiring of small businesses. And that started 15 years ago. And at first, we just did it for public projects because our customer required it. And then we woke up 6 or 7 years ago and said, well, that's not right. Why don't we have our own internal goals on every single project we do? And so we spread it across every project, no matter whether our customer required it or not. And all of a sudden, we have 3 times the diversity in our workforce today than we had 10 years ago. And we've been able to do that with partners and relationships within the community. We struggle to do that in our salaried engineer ranks. And it's easy to say, well, we're not graduating enough diversity in our universities. So we have a program now of how do we help universities, and our money flows where universities like Augsburg are building their diverse engineering workforce. We have engineers going into high schools and middle schools to teach parents, counselors, and kids what the opportunities are in our industry. We have to be much more proactive. It's no longer okay to just sit on our hands and say, it is what it is.
Okay, one of the questions I wanted to ask is, give us some projections as to where some of the areas that still are primed to really start showing more inclusion and some that need more work.
I think one that stands out for me in our region is that we've made good progress over the last few years as it relates to employment. We've seen the number for African Americans and Latinos and many of the ethnic groups continue to move up the needle. So we know that employers as a whole, the market is shifting. Employers are open to talent that may not have been coming through the doors, and that talent is finding its way to doors that they may not have known about several years ago. That said, as we look at the wage information, we see that unfortunately we're connecting people of color to the lowest paying jobs. When we think about our work, employment is important, clearly. Everybody needs a job who wants to be working in the workforce. Income is significantly important because you can imagine your first job and remembering when you saw that first paycheck and saw how many taxes they were taking out of it, the shock that you felt, and then the paycheck that you make today, right? It feels a lot different. So we know that income is important, but beyond that, wealth building is huge. And too often we don't connect the dots between what is it that helps a person get a job, what is it that helps them make sure that income bias and wage bias isn't at play, so I don't make less than what my colleague makes in the same job. But then looking out at our entire region to say, how are we making sure that we're removing the institutional and systemic barriers to wealth building in our community? That's major. But it starts right back there at that job and at wages. If we can start to begin to see change happen there, if we get to parity, where we don't see the gap in wages for people of color when we norm for education that we see today, we can see ourselves out saying, okay, we can start to see wealth happen. When we see barriers to housing, to being able to not only purchase a home, but to be able to access affordable rental homes. We'll begin to see people moving on that path toward wealth building. And the same is true certainly as it relates to business investment and making sure that entrepreneurs of color don't just have an open door to say, come open a business. We open businesses faster and more frequently than anyone and have that innovation happening. But then are those businesses capitalized and resourced with what they need to be able to truly thrive, to be able to participate in the supply chain of large organizations and small ones like mine, such that those businesses not only grow for themselves, but grow and help the talent that they hire, then grow with their own income and their pathway to wealth.
Yeah, I think there's a big opportunity as we sort of conceive of economic development policy to not just take the demand side of the market as a given. Say, okay, we have the employers that we have the kinds of jobs and industries that we have. Our job is to source them with talent, right? You got to do that. But I also think what regions like this one and many other, similarly overall high-performing regions are increasingly lacking is a kind of middle market, middle-wage jobs that actually provide a platform for communities of color to begin to build wealth, to invest in businesses, to invest in their communities, to invest in home ownership. So economic development policies that focus not only at the very, very high end of the market and recruiting employers in high-paying industries like technology and sciences, professional services, but thinking about what are the middle wage employers of the future, and some of them you're going to recruit, some of them you're going to grow organically, some of them you're going to invest in through entrepreneurship strategies, and then what do career ladders look like within industries and increasingly across sectors too, that provide folks with access to those kinds of middle wage jobs that I think are increasingly too rare in communities and are at the source of this inequality by income, inequality by race. I think that's a big opportunity for economic development to think differently about how to create a more equitable future.
We have 1 minute for someone to have the last word.
Well, I'll try to be quick. I don't know if it's the last word, but one of the really important things we can do this year to take this data to action is to strengthen the market for all of these solutions. And there's something free that we can do that will matter. We're going to set some goals, right? And this is, you're going to see more of this in the months to come. The regional dashboard is something we created as a region to understand how we were doing. The goal was never to make it an observatory, right? It is meant to be a platform of action. So they're going to be a set of regional goals that we'll work together to set, and some of those goals are going to be specifically focused on racial inclusion, and put that in the center, in the forefront of this region, and say this is all of our business, and it is central to growth. And having those goals out there, that's how all of the rest of our lives work, right? You put a goal out there and you get some shared commitment and shared accountability, and now we start really every day, every week, everything counts as we start chipping away at that goal, because there's no one thing that we're going to do, and there's no one organization. We're going to do this together. But I think the center is going to play a really important role in incredibly shaping those goals and in helping us all get there.
Please thank our panelists.